I'll never forget
Welcome,
the
everybody.
day I
This
read a
is
book.
September's,
It was contagious,
book reading
70 pages.
discussion.
There
This
were
book,
pictures
this
here and there,
month,
so
we're gonna
it
be
wasn't
talking
hard to
about
bear.
Heinrich von
Today,
Kleist,
I read a
Michael
book.
Kohlhaas, which is really, I mean, it's a classic short novel, but also a classic story that, you know, from generation to generation, it's clear that it's a story that's got a tremendously compelling narrative, and actually seems to be in some ways more popular now than it might have been, say, 100+ years ago. So joining us for this discussion, we have Matthew Spencer, who is familiar with Kleist because he translated back a few years ago. This is from Sublunary Editions, who is one of my favorite publishers, partly because they're also connected to our favorite distributor, Astraea Books in Seattle. This is a collection of anecdotes that Kleist von Kleist published in newspaper form originally, and a nice variety. Some of these are a paragraph long. Some of these are stories that you'll see in Kleist collections. This is the Penguin Kleist, for example, which is the first time I got exposed to Kleist. We'll start out. Usually we start by talking about what we've been reading in the past month. It's been a couple of months since we met. So it'd be a couple of months, but given that Matthew has taken the time to join us, we might start off by having him talk a little bit. Of course, Michael Kohlhaas, let me just do a little share here for a moment. So Michael Kohlhaas, there's lots of different translations of this, probably about a half dozen in or out of print, lots of different editions, particularly because some of the translations are old enough to be in the public domain. Sometimes separately as a little truly wafer-thin book. Often it's going to be included in collections of Kleist's stories. Also a popular, there's been at least 3 studio film productions and 1 Playmobil production, which is fun. If you have time, go look for Playmobil Michael Kohlhaas. It's in German, but you can figure it out if you've read the book. The first one, I guess, was back in the 60s by Volker Schlondorf, which I think was actually marketed to English-speaking markets under like The Horse Thief or something like that, or a man on horseback, something like that. I mean, you're really going to have to look for this movie because it's fallen off the face of the film world planet, so to speak. Then it's been made as a Western by John Cusack. John Cusack, I think, actually produced this movie as well as starred in it. And it's essentially the Michael Kohlhaas story, except with a bull instead of horses. And the same sort of, revolt against blind injustice. And then most recently, there was a big style, it's actually a French, it's sort of those quasi-European productions. So we have a Danish actor in the lead. I think, I'm blanking on the name of the German actor. We all know him because he was in Downfall and many other great. But it takes place in French, and I have to say, it's big on action. It's really is not a convincing film in my mind. It just doesn't. It doesn't project into medieval France with a Catholic regime quite in the same way that it does in Germany under, during the Reformation, when Lutheranism had come to, and Martin Luther plays an active role in the story. And so Heinrich von Kleist, I will turn it over to Michael now. This is the oldest book we're reading this year, but I think in many ways it seems so current, partly because the story is so compelling, and it does seem like not just because there's been recently this Michael Hoffmann translation from New Directions rather, that has got a lot of press when it came out. It was in the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. But there's something about the story that, it has not been out of print in English since probably the 50s. And it's probably selling more copies in English now than it ever did, I would suspect. So Matthew, I mean, how did you come to decide to translate the Anecdotes?
Well, because a lot of them, unlike Michael Kohlhaas, like weren't translated. You have some of the more famous in the material that Kleist brought out in his newspaper in Berlin, the Berliner Abendblätter, published some of his most famous stuff, like The Beggar Woman of Locarno was a famous story by him. Also, Saint Cecilia and the Power of Music. And so, but aside from a few anecdotes here and there about the boxers, or it really had gone untranslated. There some of them were tucked into an edition, came out I think in the 70s or 80s of his letters, and that's really the most complete edition you've had of those Anecdotes ever, really. Some of them, so far as I know, were never translated. And so, he's one of the major German authors, certainly one of the major German authors of his time period. And I don't know, I'm not skeptical or cynical about people retranslating sort of established classics. I think there's good work. I think Michael Hoffmann's, I'm not on a first name basis with him, but I think his translation is good. But for me personally, I was interested in those because they show a little bit of a different side. They're still very dense and weird, but some of there's humor in all of like Kleist's work, but some of them were more obviously humorous or touched on subjects that people don't know him for, or he was kind of unknown that he was a newspaper man. In fact, the new founder of the first daily newspaper in Berlin. So that aspect of his career was really interesting to me, and I thought it would be very useful to kind of bring that to attention of English speaking readers.
Mm-hmm. And how is, one thing that strikes me reading having read now, I guess, 3 different translations, is it's pretty lightweight in terms of the prose, I guess, in terms of you don't feel like you're trudging through the prose, and there's a fair amount of German literature in English translation that has a certain turgidity to it, and this doesn't seem to be characteristic of and is it, would one say Kleist or von Kleist? Which one would he prefer to be referred to?
I mean, based on his time period, as a Prussian nobleman, he was from a noble family. The Von Kleists are historically important, like throughout kind of the period of like Prussia, from like the kind of beginnings of Prussia as a state into Kleist's own era. He served in the Prussian military in his youth, and in fact fought against France in one of the wars of the coalition. I can never get these straight. I think it's the Second War of the Coalition. Anyway, he fought in the Rhineland, and was even though he was a social misfit, he was very much ensconced in that elite world of, aristocrats, professional officers, statesmen, civil administrators, and things like that. So von Kleist would be, but Kleist is fine, and I would think that maybe some of his descendants might insist a little bit more on that versus him, but who he was, quite an erratic. It's kind of difficult to think what he would think, because he was, very, very slippery, very elusive person. We don't actually, compared to his sort of writer peers in the time period, we actually don't know very much about him at all. He's destroyed a lot of his work, destroyed a lot of his correspondence. He was kind of a mystery to everybody he knew. So,
And who,
nobody knows
in
what
his
he thought of.
generation, I'm certainly no expert on German literature, but the first thought I had in terms of a point of comparison, particularly with some of the stories like the Beggar Woman of Locarno, and the kinds of the stories that have a little bit more of a fantastical edge, is certainly Hoffmann. It certainly worked in the same length, same kind of, but diverged from, like, the Grimms were essentially collecting folk stories, I guess, whereas Hoffmann and Kleist were taking maybe little bits of narrative past and then taking them forward in a new fictive direction, I guess.
Yeah. So Hoffmann is a good example. And the as a peer, right? And I don't know terribly much about Hoffmann's biography, but in terms of like the subject matter, the narrative tone, the sort of taking maybe accounts from history or legend, and transforming them into into like other literary forms. That's a good comparison. But also, the Grimms aren't bad too, because they're a little bit younger than Kleist, but they were thing is, Wilhelm was involved with Kleist in his newspaper, and published stuff like that. And the Grimms were great champions of Kleist after he died in the early 1810s. And we're one of the first people to really insist on some of these prose pieces having literary value, because he was not acclaimed during his lifetime at all. And in fact, like, aside from a few plays that are actually kind of minor now, and in fact I'm kind of struggling with the names, like he wasn't successful.
Well, it seems like initially he was better remembered as a playwright than, and now it seems to have flipped. One has to search pretty hard to find his plays in English, and certainly mention of them, whereas there's all sorts of collections of his fiction.
Yeah, and a lot of that, though, has to do with the relative standing of drama in the English speaking world, especially in America, because we have classical theater, we have basically just Shakespeare, and then some other maybe the Shakespeare company in your town or city might do some other historical plays, or they might do but they certainly don't do a lot of stuff in translation. But if you go to Germany, like most Germans know him through Michael Kohlhaas because they study it in German. They, it's like part of sort of your like gymnasium, in German it's called Germanistic, like English is a
Right.
subject, German is a subject there. You kind of study that text as a matter of course. But also he is known for his dramas, and you can go to any kind of regional like city and see fairly often a Kleist play in production. I saw when I was teaching abroad in Austria, I went over and saw Amphitryon, his play, staged in Vienna, for example. There were, stagings in like Linz, Salzburg, like all of these different places. So if you go anywhere in the German speaking world, and they have live theater is very important there still. The theaters are like well funded. They have translations of drama from all different backgrounds, and it's very lively. And so people, whether it's through education and as just a normal theater goer, will see a Kleist play. It's very
Right.
common to have that. And I think English speakers kind of miss out on that aspect, which is just as important, basically.
Yeah, that's true. That's a great observation, because definitely it's very true of French speaking countries and Italian, Italy and Spain. The theaters there, you're still going to see Lope de Vega and Moliere and Corneille and
Mhm.
Schiller. I mean, I the number of times I saw Schiller playing at some theater in Germany when we were living in Europe was constant, definitely.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a very valid observation for sure. Just as a completely diverting side plug, I will mention that a theater in Bern, Switzerland is doing the first stage adaptation of a book that I helped bring back to life called Gentlemen Overboard by Herbert Clyde Lewis. So yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
as you can
And
imagine, it's pretty much a one man
Yeah.
play. And I can imagine it's it would have I would love to see it, even though my German is only passable, Tourist Deutsch, but just to see how they stage a story about a man treading water for hours. But
You're very
yeah, the
wet in the front
theater,
row.
oh my gosh, we went to a few plays when we lived in Belgium and went to other towns, even if we didn't, even if it wasn't in English, just because it's such a vibrant theater scene in that. So, well, okay. So let's hear, folks. Was everybody familiar with Michael Kohlhaas, or was this the first reading for you? Had anybody? Go ahead.
Certainly for me, because I'd read before the who is it? Is it David Luke and Nigel Reeves version?
Mhm.
And yeah, when this came out, the Michael Hoffmann one, I read that a couple of years ago when it came out. Partly I got that because I'll read anything Michael Hoffmann translates. I think he's an excellent translator and poet, and just also has good taste. If he translates something, I'm almost certainly going to like it. But yeah, I just was interested to see, because almost all of his work has been on 20th century writers. And there was actually less difference between the two translations than I might have expected. But yeah, I loved it. It's such a relentless, bloody-minded book. It actually is funny because the book it most reminds me of, and this is possibly going to sound stupid, is the first Richard Stark Parker novel, Payback. This guy at the start who has all his money nicked from him in a heist gone wrong, and he's just absolutely determined to get it back. And when people won't listen to him, he'll just do terrible things to them. until they take him seriously, and he just sort of moves up the chain of sort of organized crime until he gets his money back. And it has that same kind of relentless tension to it. And
today somebody on one of the social medias suggested that Point Blank was a film adaptation of Michael Kohlhaas.
Yes, exactly. Point Blank is that
loose. I mean, I'd be interested. Actually, Levi Stahl from the University of Chicago Press is a real Richard Stark expert, and I should ask him whether or not Donald Westlake, who wrote all of these kind of hard crime noir novels, sort of as the Stark novels, as Richard Stark, wrote Payback and with Michael Kohlhaas. I kind of think not, just because I don't think there were a lot of English translations floating around in like cheap editions in the 50s.
Yeah. But it very much has that same atmosphere to it.
Maybe not in the 50s, but you really did see kind of an uptick of interest in Kleist during the 60s. I think that's when a lot of translations came out, the 60s and the 70s. That was right when like Susan Sontag was really championing a lot of these German writers, Walser, Kafka, Benjamin, but also kind of Kleist as this sort of representative of like along with as a sort of like proto-modernist almost, like Kafka really. So once people Kafka started to like percolate into sort of the English speaking world, people knew like, okay, he was really interested in Kleist and a really intense and admiring reader of him. And so you get a lot more translations in the 60s and a lot more kind of critical interest in him. There's studies that come out of him around that time. So it's
and Kohlhaas was one of his favorite books too, wasn't it? It was one of Kafka's favorite books.
Yes.
He raved about
Yeah,
it.
he loved it.
Yes.
He loved it.
Yeah.
And Westlake loved Kafka. That is something he says in one of his forwards to something that Kafka is, life is Kafka, he says basically.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it certainly is in Westlake. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe there is that path there between the two books. That would be interesting.
So I first read this in a German literature class in college, and I think that the professor assigned it because Kleist is so easy to read, even for a modern reader. His prose is just very spare, even though it has a lot of accretions. But I have a question that my professor wasn't able to answer. Now, 40 years later, I can get an answer to this. Why did he change the first name of the historical figure from Hans to Michael?
I don't know. And there's a lot we don't kind of know about why that, may be. Like I can tell you some other kind of like interesting changes that people probably know the reason. It was first published, the first kind of section was published in Dresden itself, through a journal that Kleist was involved in called Phoebus. And he actually it happened that the story takes place in Dresden, right? Well, he kind of anonymized the some of the locations and perhaps maybe the person as well. I don't know. That might be, maybe he liked the sound of the name, maybe who wanted to like have a little bit of ambiguity, because at the time that this was published, this is during the Napoleonic era, so this whole business with like these kind of like petty states and the Holy Roman Empire was kind of getting swept away, but like you still kind of had these aristocratic families, including the von Trancas, you know, the villains of the story, right? Around there. And so, you know, like there's commentary, like especially in German, where there's the, like, you know, he probably was tailoring the story to, who's always scandalous. I don't know, you know, he might as well have just gone out and said it all, because most of the consensus was he was kind of a tasteless writer anyway during his time period. But that question might be kind of related to him, like in that first publication, editing out the places around him, like being discreet. You know, he tried being discreet and being kind of censoring himself, but it never quite worked out, you know, and he always, one way or another, kind of put his foot in his mouth. But I find the arguments that he self-censored a little bit of the comment on the first publication kind of convincing. So it might be related to that.
Well, he does, just to piggyback on that comment, because one thing I find, to me, this seems like a very transitional text, in the sense that, you know, there are moments, I mean, Kohlhaas's reaction for a fair amount of the narrative is the reaction of a revolutionary who's trying to overthrow an unjust power. And yet, as he kind of goes overboard in the violence and intensity of his reaction, now it's almost like a Greek tragedy of, you know, pride goeth before the fall. It's like Oedipus blindly trying to struggle against fate. And so it's sort of like, well, is this a modern, you know, a romantic revolutionary, or is this kind of saying you can't fight City Hall, so to speak?
It does have that element though too at the end, because in the end he does get to die kind of on his own terms, which is a sort of a kind of not exactly a rebuttal to the, you know, pride comes before a fall. I mean, he does end badly, but he ends badly the way he chooses to end badly, which is again a nice sort of twist on what you might expect to happen in a story like that published at the time.
Well, then we get that little magical realism twist that comes in of the fortune teller who comes out of, I mean, completely unmentioned previously, but
Yeah.
oh,
Did he think he had an ace in the hole with the papers? Somehow, like, if I eat these, then they are like, yeah, it was kind of because he keeps getting absorbed deeper and deeper into this legal entanglement, where they take away his military power, and then they say, well, you have to stay in this house. You're free to go, of course, but these guys are going to hang out and watch you also. Like, he keeps getting deeper into the bureaucratic web, which is like, I was thinking of Kafka the entire time. It's really funny to just kind of like, why was Kafka so moved by this? And then it's like, because this was like the primordial ooze of a state, whereas Kafka's dealing with whatever. But the paper and the fortune teller was wild. I didn't really know what to make of it all. Very cool.
I think one of the things that really, I think Brad saying is transitional is really smart, because on the one hand, he's like a classic revolutionary, gets together an army and stuff, but he also tries to go through the channels every time. Oh, well, you know, the so-and-so doesn't want to do this, so that, you know, I'm going to talk to the regional governor. Oh, the regional governor doesn't want to do it, so I'm going to talk to the assistant to the, you know, and keep going. And then maybe I'll bring Martin Luther in. Why not? You know, he keeps looking for an institutional solution. And what I
Right.
love about him eating the paper is that it's such a great fuck you to, you know, you know, it's like, no, forget it. I'm just going to swallow this paper. You can't have it.
But certainly very early on, I mean, essentially his first judgment from the system should have sent him a message that you are fighting an institution which is not going to give in, can't give in, because we can't admit that you, essentially a rankless commoner, have something over somebody with a title, because then it all falls apart, right? I mean, there was still some sort of a belief of the great chain of being and divine rule of the, even though I mean, there's lots of little democratic elements coming into it. The power has percolated down quite a bit, but still, the idea that, put a bond in front of your name and suddenly magic happens. You can't be wrong.
But how they had it in the beginning of the book, he seemed to think that, they emphasized that he was really well liked. He has his land, Kohlhaas, he even has a town ostensibly that's his. And so I think it appeared like he was just completely flabbergasted by what happened and that he was taxed at all.
Well, that's it, because he's a guy who's everything, the world has worked for him up to this point.
Yeah, what
So,
happened?
until that point, it seemed like everything is just and natural and this is how it should be. And then suddenly that's undermined and he, goes berserk eventually.
Right. The
Right.
harder you
He got
fight,
really mad.
the less responsive the system is.
Yeah.
Everything was all right under the old, Papa von Tronka, but now this new guy is fucking everything up. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and in these, they're like these kind of like inflection points, and they usually kind of revolve around sort of what could happen otherwise. Like in the beginning, when the new von Tronka kind of like he's asked for his pass, and there's a pause in the narrative where he kind of considers, well, should I lodge a complaint or not? I'm gonna complain. And so that starts the, that brings the attention of the von Tronkas and like, hey, those are nice horses. Let's keep them for a while. And then sort of later on in the narrative, when when his wife, poor woman, is just pleading and pleading with him, just like, just drop it, come on, like, and he's like, and like he's already kind of fixated on this now, but you can almost, there's a bit of suspense there where he's like she's like gotten through with them and it's just like, okay, I'll negotiate, you're too hard-headed, and then look what happens to her, and then like like another one when he gets that message from his like deputy who's gone outlaw, and he kind of decides on whether he wants to sign a response to that letter, which is like kind of the ultimate thing that condemns him, or the ultimate thing that kind of proves that he's an outlaw. He has a kind of a wavering moment there too. So like there's like as a dramatist, like like within those like individual sentences that describe that, you have these sort of like suspenseful moments where the like stops a minute for a beat, and they might talk about how weird a character is dressed or how weird he looks, or like how awful the weather is, and then by the end of the sentence, he like Kohlhaas has just decided to go on his own way again. So it's a very it's a I think what makes this effective as a novella and a dramatic and as a piece of like truly kind of narrative, it's telling a story, and it's in a way hyper plotted, so many things happen, is that you have within all of these complex things, you have these very finely balanced moments of like decision and suspense where things it has to continue down this tragic path, but it's suspended in an interesting way.
I mean, when he responds positively to his, the guy who's still roaming around the country, messing with people's life, it's not going to end well. There's any chance of anything. I mean, it's not going to end well from the beginning simply because it's so intense. But at that point, he really has locked the door behind him and committed to, his chances of ever getting in the good graces of those in power goes out the door instantly with that response.
And I think too, overall, it's a great case of the value of the novella length, because again, it's a sort of story that in any lesser writer's hands would have been a big, fat, epic book with all the battles fully detailed.
Oh
and,
gosh, yes.
Going into all the
Yeah.
lives. And, though that would have been the obvious way to do it, that would have been a much worse book. This short, compact, intense plot driving on, is all to the book's betterment. It's just, it's fantastic.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me. Some years ago, I decided to try to see if the German novelist Robert Neumann, Alfred Neumann, Robert Neumann is actually a pretty good writer, but Alfred Neumann is ham-fisted and he sort of takes a story like this. It's set in Belgium, medieval Belgium, but it's this sort of intense guy working his way into power and then having problems. But it is so overlong and full of the worst habits of a German novelist of that period, which is, it's been 5 pages and I haven't philosophized, so let me
There's a
let me
quote on
sharpen
the
the
back of
pencil and start some more. And by the 3rd or 4th time you hit that, you just kind of give up the will to live. And I mean, if this had been longer, it would have been a much worse book, I think. But thank God, I mean, the man wrote like he knew he was going to die at a young age. I got to get these stories out on the page.
Yeah, the narrative economy is really something else, and he can write a complete and narratively complete story in a single paragraph. And what a novelist of that school, I like Thomas Mann, but go on and on, or maybe something like Stefan Zweig, where it was just you would have these events as like an occasion for this kind of like high melodrama, and sentimentality, and they're kind of dispatched within a single clause of a single sentence, and I do like that I love Musil, I do love the big philosophical tone, but getting across sort of what Kleist wanted to get across. It's you can do it in a very, very short amount of time, and spend the minor characters you're dispatched one way or another, and the minor incidents just go by. And so it's very in that way, it's very tight, and he's like the theater director that's like like in the wings waiting for everybody to hit their marks, right, and get the production moving. So
There are a couple of, it seems to me there are a couple of, I guess, Austrian German writers of the 20th century that seem to follow in his footsteps, like Leo Perutz and Alexander Lernet, Holenia, are both these, their books are all, 150, 200 pages. They're narrative driven. There's usually some action, there's some fantastic element in it, and there's a lot of Kleistian flavor in their books, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. An aside is I actually taught English in the town where Leo Perutz died, in Bad
Okay.
Ischl, up in the Alps. Very beautiful
Yeah.
spot town. It's the summer residence of the Austrian emperors in the 19th century. Very and yeah, like love his books. Yeah, very uh very, very compact, very narrative driven. I would say also, I would, people talk about Kafka. I would actually also in certain ways, the economy is like, Borges too is like somebody who's very, very focused on narrative economy. Very different writer too, but also Robert Walser. His stories are eventless. They're all about, some guy walking around, and telling you how nice how green the grass looks even when it's poking up out of the snow. And he wrote this long short story, beautiful, called Kleist, which is about which is like set very early in Kleist's career, where he's deciding to be a writer, and he kind of he ensconces himself in this lakeside castle. And Robert Walser likes to imagine him sort of having these like psychedelic experiences with peasants in the mountains, and him kind of being drawn into his own kind of personal doom, even as he's like enchanted by the world around him.
Right.
I don't know where it is in translation. I'm sure that one of the NYRB collections has that in there, but yeah, highly recommend if you're interested in some more Kleistian details and kind of Kleistian economy as Walser, especially that story. So,
Well, also, Krista Wolff wrote a Kleist novel, didn't she? I
yes,
forget the
yeah,
name of it. No Place on Earth or something like that.
something like that. Yeah,
Yeah. I'll put the title in the
yeah.
comments on the video. So, well, let's if we can, just because we're getting past the quarter hour towards the end, let's do a quick round of any other good wafer-thin books that you want to share with the folks, and then I have one last note about next month's discussion that I want to make sure to mention. So, James, what's been hot on your plate?
Look, I've got a few, so I'll go through fairly quickly. To start off with a couple of Australian ones. There's Astraea by Kate Kruimink. She's a Australian Tasmanian writer. This is her third book. It actually won a competition, the Weatherglass Novella Prize, which is a new prize where the winner gets published each year. Just a fantastic, wonderfully written. It's about a shipload of women being transported to New South Wales, when it's still a kind of convict settlement, and just particularly one woman who, she's still, she's only about 14 or 15, who's been separated from her baby because of her conviction and sent out, and just sort of her journey on the boat. Sort of darkly comic, excellent book. And the other Australian one is My Brother Jazz, which is just probably only 80 pages, not very much writing. Just a memoir about, I think it was written in about 3 days without sleep, about his brother who sort of committed suicide by driving into traffic when he was a teenager, and just he'd ignored it. He'd sort of repressed it his whole life, and then one day he just sat down and just wrote this in this kind of frenzy. Again, beautifully written book. Now I'm going to mispronounce his name, I'm sure. Aimé Césaire's Return to My Native Land, which is, yes, a quite condensed sort of surrealist prose poem about anti-colonial movements. He was a Martinique writer, French Pacific, not Pacific, Caribbean colony, and it sort of kickstarted the whole movement, I guess, of anti-colonial writing. This version's translated by Thomas Berger and Anna Bostock. Sorry, motoring through quickly. The Wife of Martin Guerre by Janet Lewis. I've had this sitting around the house for about 20 odd years. Yeah, finally got to it. Yes, another kind of historical incident, slightly altered and then fictionalized. You know, the famous story of the man who disappears, and then when he comes back, is it actually him or is it an imposter? But again, beautifully written, fascinating book. And finally,
there is, by the way, I think I posted this months and months ago, but there is an actual historical book that's Wafer-Thin by, I think it's Natalie Davis Zelwyn, which actually is about, she goes into the history, and it's absolutely fascinating how much, you know, was actually right to the mark in terms of being historically accurate.
It does seem that all the most surprising stuff seems to be in the stuff that was most true. It's quite odd. And finally, it's an old book, but only recently published, Helen Wolff's Background for Love, which was translated by Tristram Wolff, her nephew, I think. She and her then husband later, they fled Nazi Germany and ended up in the US and started Pantheon Books. But this was a book she wrote before that. She never ended up publishing it in her lifetime. I think she just decided she liked being a publisher more than a writer. But it's sort of a, if you like, say, Jean Rhys novels, it's a bit like that, except that the main character is actually capable of living life without falling to pieces at the slightest provocation. It's just, a woman and her faithless older boyfriend decide to, go to France to get away from the kind of rising National Socialist horribleness, and then shenanigans ensue. But it's very good. So I hope that was coherent. I'll let someone else speak.
Anybody else want to have some they want to recommend from the last couple months' readings?
Yeah, so I have Ryunosuke Akutagawa's Kappa.
Oh yeah.
This is a newish translation from New Directions. Very, very good. Also a Kleistian writer. I don't know the history of Kleist in Japan, but like he was very, very popular writer. And actually Akutagawa mentions Kleist directly. So for people who aren't familiar, kappas are these like water like ogre imps that like drown children. And the narrative is about this man who is initially thought of as insane, like recounts his journey to the land of the kappa, to these water imps, and it's a sort of social satire, about early 20th century, just in general, early 20th century Japanese society, and a kind of like cruel capitalism and militarism that was like present at the time. Really, really, really good. Excellent translation. There was a translation in the 60s that wasn't as good. I think the quality of the material kind of shines forth, but this one is very, very excellent.
Okay.
And then also I want to mention for my own self-interest is I'm doing a reprint of the Daisy Ashford long short story novella, The Young Visitors. I don't have a copy. It's in the printers now. I have her biography, which is written by a relative, but she wrote this comedy of manners when she was 9 years old in the late 1800s for the entertainment of her family. And then sort of a little bit after World War I, as an adult woman, she rediscovered this manuscript, and it circulated around with friends and then became a surprise hit bestseller. Yeah, it's very, very weird, very funny, a bit edgy. It's like, it's a, if you like a kind of like sort of mean, evil and noir, like,
Mhm.
vile bodies, or the sort of like, sort of like jaundiced picture of high society, but through the eyes of a 9-year-old. This is kind of this basically what the book is.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I just learned, in fact, after that, I forwarded that post, the British writer David Quantick contacted me, and he said that Ring Lardner published a complete parody or kind of takeoff on the Young Visitors called The Young Immigrants, and that's grunts with a U. And the whole book design, in fact, was like at least the American edition, in terms of illustrations, all of that. So he's going to write a piece for Neglected Books about that. So
Cool.
you
Yeah, look forward to that.
yeah. Anyone else have something you'd like to pass along as a recommendation?
Yeah, I've already recommended this to you, Brad, but I'm going to say this to the group in general. Come to the Window, a novel by Howard Norman. It's a little long for a wafer-thin book, but it's very quick read. Also a little strange, a little magical realism. It's about a murder in Nova Scotia that happens during World War I, and a newspaper man decides that he's just going to turn his life over to seeing this thing through to the end. The murderer escapes. She becomes pregnant by the court reporter. He and his wife, who's a doctor, kind of go up to the wilds of Nova Scotia in pursuit of her, and they wind up just meeting a lot of strange people. It's a beautifully written book, very simple, very lovely, a little Kleistian. I don't know if Kleist was an influence on Howard Norman, but really wonderful book. Just came out very recently.
Was that called
Super.
Come to
Thank
the
you for
Window?
that.
Yes, Come to the Window by Howard Norman.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, that just makes me think of that scene in Help where they're trying to get one of the Beatles to come to the window so they can shoot him with the paint. Come to the window. So anyone else want to pass along a recommendation? Well, let me mention a couple. I posted about most of these on Twitter, but definitely just looking back on them, they're just really memorable. Probably the first was a novel called The Life of Rebecca Jones by Angharad Price, which is a Welsh novel. Very, very simple. It's basically about a Welsh farm woman reflecting on her life in a fairly remote valley in Wales and her family. And it's just so, so well written. I mean, it just wonderful. I don't normally like farm novels much, but it was just captivating. Also, I thought very powerful, and although I have to say, it led me to watch the movie. So it was the French title is La Douleur, which is how it was pronounced, published in the UK. It was published as Wartime by Marguerite Duras. It's essentially 4 separate little memoir pieces about her experiences right at the end of, well, say from the D-Day on. Partly first, her first husband had been arrested because he was with the resistance and was in a camp, but no one knew when he was coming back and what condition. He came back essentially within moments of death. He was so physically worn down and deprived, very intense. Do not watch the movie version of that. It is absolutely horrible. it's horrible in the way that so many historical recreation movies, not recreation movies, are these days, in that, the everyone is clean, everyone's clothes, and that's, if you know anything about France under the occupation, one of the things is people couldn't get new clothes. So they wore them out, and they're all clean and they're neat, and they've all taken baths within the last, and showers within the last 3 hours. And it just is, and the streets are clean and swept, and everything's immaculate. And that's a sort of production gloss that completely undermines the
I
credibility.
can remember I read
Plus-
one review of it, said that the main problem, and this has ruined most historical films for me now, is the problem with almost every historical film is that you can see that the characters use hair conditioner, and it's true, and it's ruined almost all of them.
Well, one of the other things that really ruins that movie is that it relies hugely on voiceover narration. And that is just such an incredibly delicate technique to use. And you cannot use it for minute after minute after minute while you have a picture of the heroine looking pensively out the window, or once in a while, you drop a little bit of that in. You cannot make hours of the movie. And of course, like all movies these days, it's 2 hours and 15 minutes long or longer. So anyway, enough of that rant. Another one, much less well known, I thought very Kafkian, was A House of Childhood by a German writer named Marie-Louise Kaschnitz. And it was translated. There was an amazing series that the University of Nebraska Press did of European translations, French and German and several other, and a lot of them are very short books. Came out in the late 90s in English translation. And it's essentially about this woman a man is passing down the street, and he says, "Can you tell me where the House of Childhood is?" And she says, I don't know. I've never, I've lived here all my life. I don't know where it is. And then she starts wandering around her neighborhood, and there's the House of Childhood. And it's like this museum, but it's a very bizarre museum, and that, there are rooms which have experiences that only you will have remembered from childhood. And it's just amazing kind of concept and where she goes with it, because the protagonist in her book is someone who essentially says, I had a childhood, no big deal, it's not worth remembering. And then, of course, the stuff starts coming out. So I think that's a book I would definitely recommend digging out. It's out of print, but yeah, I'm sure there are tons of used copies available. And the last one I'll mention I wrote about on Neglected Books is a memoir called Miss Abby Fitch-Martin, which is about the worst aunt ever to end up as your guardian. And she was just this horrifying Victorian character. It's in the United States, and around Schenectady, New York, or Syracuse, New York. But I mean, the woman was pathologically selfish and horrible. I mean, she gets these two kids are essentially left to her, and her brother, who's a bit of a drunk, but left to her because their parents both die, or her mother dies and the father is like in the wind. And they show up on the doorstep, and she kind of says, well, I didn't want to have you in the first place, so there's your room, go to bed. And like, I don't want to see you until the morning. And they were hungry, they were cold, scared. Go into that room. They go into the room, she locks the door behind them, and she doesn't let them out until, breakfast time in the morning. And their breakfast, of course, is like prison food. And it's just amazing that like there are, this is a Charles Dickens character in real life. In fact, Dickens would probably shy away from being as bad, having somebody as bad as this woman was. And yet it's super well written, very funny and diverting and fascinating character study. So that's one I'd mention. Anybody have another one you want to mention before we wrap up? Because we're over the hour, and I just want to mention what we have coming up next month. It's kind of another special guest. There we go. So, oh, by the way, if you are interested, next week you can go to the Kleist Fest in Germany. I know you all want to get tickets to go to Frankfurt on Oder to see that. It's a whole week of activities, a weekend of activities, special. You can go to the Kleist Museum and find out all the details. But the special news is that our October book is Jen Craig's Panthers in the Museum of Fire. This is a relatively new Australian novella. And I reached out through intermediary and got in contact with Jen Craig. And she is going to join our reading group. When we talk about it, it'll be Monday, October the 28th here in the US, Tuesday morning, October 29th in Australia. So that'll be a special treat. So with that, let me thank you all for joining us. I will post this to YouTube when I get a break. I've got to go rescue my wife whose alternator went out while we were talking. But again, thanks for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed reading Michael Kohlhaas. I think that was one of the more special books that we've come across this year, and I appreciate your taking part in the discussion. Happy reading, everybody, and thank you, Matthew, for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, thank you,
Welcome.
Matthew.
Take care.